Excellent. I will go ahead and share my screen. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining me. Today, we're going to be going over a variety of different issues in relationship to mental health and undocumented students. I wanted to thank everybody for their time. And also, I just want to make sure that I have all of this on the screen here. 1 second. Host disabled person. Oh, if you can make me either a host or a co-host so I can share my screen.
All right, you should be good now.
Thank you. All right. So I wanted to start off just by sharing some basics just about myself. First off, my name is Oliver Camacho, as you may already know. I'm your presenter today, but really this journey comes through a lot of years of experience. One of the things that I do, and right now I'm a doctoral candidate at Northern Illinois University, and I'm completing counselor education at my doctorate in counselor education. More specifically, as a counselor educator, you learn to wear many hats, and I mentioned that because it's a a very dynamic field. Besides being a former school counselor, I also am a mental health counselor. I actually have a private practice in St. Charles, where I also specialize in doing immigrant psychological hardship evaluations. So one of the interesting things for me throughout that practice, I've also been able to volunteer. And as a volunteer, I've been able to work with various different undocumented students and also refugees. Because of my area of practice, one of the things that I've learned is many times different school districts end up reaching out to me and asking me just for consultation help. There's various specialized cases that students and also parents and educators reach out for me too. And that's something that I'll be talking a little bit more about in the following. Just on the more personal side, I wanted to share a couple things about myself. I actually grew up in Little Village in Pilsen. I'm a child of immigrant parents. I grew up in a mixed family status home. And that's, for me, something that really shaped me. As you can see here, I ended up at a very, very young age discovering the importance of not only finding one's voice, but really helping those that are in different positions. So that these are some pictures of me when I went to the Immigrant Freedom Ride. And if anybody knew what that was, you know, that was a couple of years back ago. More specifically, the Immigrant Freedom Ride took place early in 2012, if I'm not mistaken. And with that in mind, it was one of those first very, very large movements to help pass the DREAM Act, which would have been a pathway to citizenship. So that's something that I felt is just very, very important as we continue these particular areas of growth and areas of expansion. It's important to keep in mind that these are also times that we have to continue to advocate for others. This is also my lovely family here in the right-hand side. I have 3 children and my lovely wife, who's also she's from Mexico, more specifically. Okay, so I actually wanted to give you an overview today of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk more specifically about undocumented immigrants, a little bit less about refugees in the K-12, and I'm going to expand it to say even the K-16 education system. We are also going to be talking about multicultural and social justice approaches in schools and in higher education, specifically culturally responsive, both school counseling and pedagogy as a theoretical framework. We will also be striving to understand the multi-tier system of support as a conceptual framework for mental health delivery. And this could be used not only to serve undocumented students, but also refugee students and other students that are in marginalized communities. I did want to get a gauge here in terms of who my audience was. And I'm trying to think about it as simply as possible. I can see the chat. Maybe people can hear, people here can simply put in their name and what is your role in your institution. I think that'll probably be the simplest way for me to gauge my audience here. Fantastic. All right, this is very helpful. I'm seeing a variety of different backgrounds from admissions advisors to high school counselors. We also have some college counselors, some student success coaches, and a lot of people in admissions, even scholarships. So one of the interesting things that I always have that happen whenever I come to the Share the Dream conference is there's just such a variety of background in regards to people. And more than anything, I really want to create this space to kind of help fit your needs. You're going to find that a lot of the examples that I'm sharing, for example, I have a small case example at the end, really focuses on school counselors, but nonetheless, a lot of our frameworks here are really universal. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. All right. So one of the things that we're taking a look at right now is basically we're taking a look at a not only a literature gap, but we're also taking a look at a practice to problem gap. In essence, there's not a lot of literature out there, specifically when we're taking a look at the population between 12 to 24. There's not a lot of literature out there in regards to what are not only the best practices, but what are the prevalent issues and evidence-based practices specifically for undocumented students. So many of the things that are out there are theoretical, and that is important because it is informative. Nonetheless, we have to be aware of certain needs that are out there. So for example, one of the things that we're seeing in schools is that there's an increased number of undocumented students in schools, and also an increased number of mental health issues that are occurring not only among undocumented populations, but we're in a mental health crisis. Specifically, as we're talking about COVID and we're talking about issues relevant to schools, mental health is one of those stressors and points where everybody is asking themselves the question, how can I do better in terms of working with others and helping my students? Whether you're in admissions, a director, one starts asking themselves the question, what can I do to be not only more culturally responsive, but also what can I do to be better at supporting others and being that liaison for them. One of the things that it's also very prevalent to understand is that when I say culturally responsive practices, it really falls under an umbrella of practices. And this umbrella of practices I'll review with you more thoroughly, but more specifically, know that it's a large umbrella. We use a lot of terms like culturally responsive, culturally relevant, culturally sensitive. All of these are terms that are important in not only mental health, but also in education that help us to shape the delivery of our programs and also our services. One framework that also plays a cultural role, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about how this is also tied to more universal systems like that in public health, is something called a multi-tier system of support. If anybody is here and works in a school, like as a school counselor, many people would know what MTSS is, as it's widely used. So there's a variety of different terms that we want to acknowledge here as we are working with these students, and more specifically for undocumented students. As we are working with them, we will want to, understand some of these basic terms. For example, an undocumented immigrant is someone who resides in the country without proper documentation. And in many cases, we may also have an undocumented immigrant, that being a parent, and maybe a citizen's child. That could be someone who came from a mixed status family. Additionally, one of the things that I mentioned before was not only the term undocumented, but also I mentioned a little bit about, well, you've heard the term DACA, right? Defer Action on Childhood Arrivals. As we continue to learn and see in this particular area, DACA is something that it's important for us as advocates, as accomplices, as allies, that we're not only informed of the terms, but also the status of the terms. And I'm not going to go through the in-depth history, but I do want people to understand that these are all different terms that are prevalent, and also people need to be aware of. So, for example, the word dreamer, and even the concept of illegality, dreamer being back when one had the DREAM Act, that would have had provided a pathway to U.S. citizen to certain undocumented youth. This is something that is important to kind of keep in mind. Although this term is sometimes still used, it may not be the preferred term for a certain group of people. So it's always important to keep in mind that. And also the whole concept of illegality. Illegality is something that is often used or misused depending on the context, especially in different areas of different news reports. And really this whole concept ends up trickling down in different areas and in different studies. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind. When we're talking about meritocracy, it's an ideology of inequality, in essence, being served economically established populations to justify inequalities in society in Black and white America. It's now used to justify the segregation of new waves of immigration. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Same thing when we're talking about generation 1.5, meaning that the undocumented population came here without a particular pathway to citizenship. So relevant terms that are important, and as there are different terms, it's important to be aware of some of the current terms being used in not only in research, but also in different areas of news, etc. So I wanted to start by giving you just a small background on the undocumented population. I already went ahead and I defined further what the undocumented immigrant population is, but they usually fall into two groups: those that enter the US without inspection and those that enter the US without temporary visas. Overall, if we take a look at the population, we end up seeing there's about 11.3 million in total. And also, in regards to undocumented immigrants, a very interesting thing, we end up finding that there's 3 counties that are the top 3 counties where undocumented immigrants populate the most. One of them being Los Angeles County, Harris County in Texas, and Cook County. So those are like the respective counties in order. As you can see, Cook County being the top 3, that is one of the one that is most populated. Another growing population is that of undocumented immigrants' children. So the children of undocumented immigrants encompass approximately 3.9 million in kindergarten through 12th grade. And you want to definitely keep that in mind, especially as they develop and grow further, because these are our children that may go into become either a mixed family status, and in essence, you're gonna be able to you want to be aware of what are different factors that end up coming into play when they end up graduating. I wanted to highlight a small example here in relationship to the undocumented population in Illinois. As you can see demographically, this is the breakdown of the undocumented population in Illinois. Mexico and Central America being on the top. That's where most immigrants migrate from, undocumented immigrants. And we also have Asia and Europe, Canada, Oceania being the top, being in the top 3 there. Okay, so as you can see, there's about 5,000 in total in terms of undocumented people in Illinois. So I mentioned to you that there's definitely a literature gap. Nonetheless, there's been a variety of different authors that have written in this area and have started to study this population to a certain extent. One of the things that I'm starting to learn, especially as one researches this, is that we want to be very conscious of not only the power dynamics in research, but also the ethics in research. So acknowledging that this is a very sensitive population, it has been very politicized over the years, but nonetheless, it's an important population to take a look at. And this is a small example of what's going on in schools. Okay, so from this survey was highlighting 3,600 educators all over 24 districts in the United States. Okay, this is across 13 states. So this is over 760 schools. And one of the interesting findings that we end up having is that 85% of the educators, because they ended up studying what educators were observing in immigrants, undocumented students specifically, and they ended up observing that 85% of the educators reported students having an overt or expressing a fear of ICE, of custom enforcement agencies. That fear for the students is something that is very, very much real, and having that intervention in their lives is something that is also very prevalent. So in essence, as we're taking a look at this, you can see more specifically in the graphic on the right, what are some of the outgoing trends in the area of, for example, there's increased bullying, decreased parent involvement, parents expressing concerns at schools, indirect effects on students due to concerns for their peers, and also indirect effects on classroom climate. And one of the bigger ones is students expressing concerns and fears at school. So as I mentioned that one before, you can also see in 79.6% have mentioned increased behavioral and emotional problems or increased absenteeism. So these are also very important factors because as we know, these also impact academic performance. But at the top two here are concerned expressing fears at school and also increased behavioral and emotional problems. And I wanted, one of the things I wanted to highlight here in terms of this study was actually done before the pandemic and before Trump ended up taking office. So as you can see, there's a variety of different factors that we have to take into consideration here as we are trying to help this particular population. Some other factors to take in mind, to keep in mind are there's a variety of different stressors, one of which being acculturation stress. Acculturation stress being more specific to that stress that one ends up having as they're going through the different phases from acculturation to assimilation. Acculturation stress does come in various different phases, but it's important to know and recognize that in essence, to become adapted to a new environment, one has to acculturate and one has to one strives to become more affluent in the culture that they're developing within themselves. So cultural identity formation is one of those strong concepts that one has to be aware of, not only as a, for example, I'm thinking as not only as a counselor, but also as someone that is working with students, that one is still forming their identity. Another stressor that is prevalent is that of migratory stress. Migratory stress also comes in pre and post phases. As one migrates and is, for example, just coming to the country, similar examples of pre and post migratory stress end up taking into effect. And with some of that comes particular sets of different types of trauma, depending on their migratory journey. For some, it may have been a little bit more stressful or a little bit more traumatic in different instances. And that's something to also be aware of, that these come in different phases. Overall, and this is something that I mentioned as you're working with a variety of different students of the different types of mental health factors, the two more prevalent in many cases, not only undocumented populations, depression and anxiety are probably the most prevalent. So I did want to highlight those because those are also very, very important. Another important term here is transgenerational trauma. And a good example here is, as we're thinking about transgenerational trauma, basically that's the trauma that can be passed on from parent to child. For example, having that particular fear of ICE, can be very, very real in the eyes of the parents, but it could also be passed on to a child that maybe is, for example, a citizen because they were born here. And even though it's going to impact them in terms of their family system, that particular trauma can be outstanding. So we want to be aware of these particular terms, specifically as we're working with these populations, because in essence, it's something that is going to help us as we help others navigate. So there's a variety of different literature that helps us as we're working with undocumented populations. Specifically, when we're working with undocumented populations, one of the interesting things that I've found is that there's a variety of different frameworks that have been utilized and also repeated. But nonetheless, a lot of the studies that end up coming out have been focused on working with undocumented adults. So that's something that is also very interesting, but nonetheless, it does give us some ideas in terms of how can we also apply it in a school setting. So I wanted to highlight some important ones here. I ended up highlighting 6 on this side. This is more specifically in culturally responsive counseling for working with undocumented students. And this is also a theoretical framework that I am borrowing from the research that I'm currently doing. In my study, I do a transformative mixed method study, and I'm taking a look at what are some of the interventions that school counselors are using. But the theories that inform me are these here. So I'm going to highlight some culturally responsive counseling theories, and also some a conceptual framework, that being MTSS. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to give you just some highlights, because to be honest, for each of these, I can talk a lot in regards to why they're very, very important. But when we're talking about culturally responsive counseling, or culturally responsive school counseling, it focuses on strengthening mental health supports for undocumented students. And it's composed of seven major strands, one of which being a culturally responsive framework. So what does it mean to be culturally responsive? More specifically in the area of education, it's actually focusing on taking a look to and through students' personal and cultural strengths, their intellectual capabilities, and their prior accomplishments. So this is something that you're going to hear from me again. In other words, what Ladin Billins is talking about, she's talking about a strengths-based approach, not being deficit-centered, but really taking a look at your students' strengths. So for example, when you're advising, what are some of the strengths that you see in their, not only in their transcript, but in their grades? Are they good at math? Are they good at science? Okay, well, how can we continue to explore those as you're helping them map out their program plan, and you're helping them find out what their major may or may not be? Or as they choose their major, what are some of the things that you can ask them? Again, a culturally responsive framework in education asks you to take a look at their cultural strengths. In multicultural counseling, one of the things that we talk about is not only strengths, but we also talk about the influence of social justice and its relationship to counseling. In other words, what we're trying to do is that we're trying to develop culturally competent counseling skills, but also cultural identity and racial development. So those are, again, some key constructs here. But in essence, to develop a cultural self-awareness really comes through those affinity groups that advisors can create, or that school counselors can create. As you're creating those particular or supporting those particular dynamics, you definitely want to think about not only the developing culturally self-aware projects, but you also want to be aware of the power dynamics that are at play. How can you empower them as students? How can you empower them as being community activists, if that's something that they want? How can you help them in terms of different policy and equity within the system that they're working with? So I wanted to highlight very quickly social justice focused counseling, because in essence, what it does is it is focusing on the promotion of equity for all people and groups for the purpose of ending oppression and injustice affecting clients, students, counselors, families, communities, schools, workplaces, etc. So this is more specifically from the umbrella of the American Counseling Association. And if you think about counseling and what counselors do, the American Counseling Association oversees career counseling, school. They inform some school counseling practices also, although they kind of have separated to form their own division. But they also inform college counselors, career counselors, clinical counselors. So in essence, these are some core constructs from counseling that inform a lot of different practices. I mentioned strength-based approach, and actually in counseling, we also have a strength-based approach. In fact, one of the things that it focuses on the person's strengths to provide a positive source of motivation to deal with their lives. And it's a central theme in terms of creating strength building environments. So I definitely emphasize that again. I'll give you an example here. One particular researcher, Lisette Solis is her name. She ended up doing research in Pilsen among women that are going to a counseling clinic. And in essence, one of the things that she found is that the key to them building resilience was also finding the strengths within their communities. So it's important as you're thinking about helping a variety of different communities that or working and being either an ally and an accomplice. What are some particular frameworks that we can utilize? One of the things that I also want to acknowledge here in the area of education, we also use the term culturally sustaining. Culturally sustaining seeks to foster linguistic, literate, and also cultural pluralism as part of schooling for positive transformation through the main focus is on sustaining pluralism through education to challenges of social justice. So one of the things that I like a lot about culturally sustaining frameworks is that it focuses a lot on literature, but it also addresses what we call the language gap. Okay, the language gap is basically the gap that many people end up finding as they come here from another country and they're trying to learn a new language. So that's something to also be aware of. Finally, the one of the last terms that I wanted to talk about in theory was just critical practice. Critical practice being that which helps awaken a critical consciousness. And interestingly enough, this is also talked about in culturally responsive practices, more specifically Lansing Billings talks a little bit about developing critical dialogues in classrooms. So in the psychological realm or in the psychological realm or in the educational realm, critical consciousness comes through different particular works. In essence, it joins the psychological dimension, but also the personal dimension with a political dimension. So it's taken into account all of those particular factors. This actually comes from Martin Baro, who talks a lot more about liberation psychology. And he talks in depth about how to help a client work towards developing a critical consciousness. Another term that I wanted to emphasize here is that of acompañamiento, which is to accompany, empathize, and to empower the students that you work with. It's something that is seen in an Undocumented lens, but in essence, it's in the embodiment of mentorship, academic redemption, and also community engagement. So as you can see, there's a variety of things that we find in the literature that I wanted to highlight, but more specifically, I want to highlight an evidence-based practice that we also utilize in schools. Just to give you a different type of summary here for those that maybe do not work in schools, in essence, what a multi-tier system of support does is on the top tier here, and let me pull out my laser pointer. On the top tier here, we have our more intensive supports. So in a college setting, that may be doing what we call an outplacement, right? An outplacement, like a person going to the clinic. And then a tier 2 support can be like a support group for a student. And then a tier 1 support can be any lessons that are seen in the classroom, okay? And this could be in any educational level. But in essence, what it is, it's a systems approach that is seen specifically in K-12 systems. And it's often composed of what we call response to intervention and the positive behavioral interventions and supports. So that's something that I want to highlight. I want to give you a different visual here so that you have a better idea of how it looks like in schools. But in essence, a tier one intervention can also incorporate a universal screener, proactive steps that are research-based, like for example, differentiated instruction, social emotional learning, some targeted 2 steps can be rapid response or progress monitoring. Here we will also find a variety of different groups, small groups that one can work with. And I'll give you some examples of those small groups in our next slide here. And tier 3 ends up being students that are at high risk, need frequent progress monitoring, and also need more evidence-based programs. So that could be something like CBT, for example. And I think I have, I don't have an example in the next slide here. But yes, this is just like a small overview of some of these multi-tier systems of supports that are seen in schools. All right. So in essence, one of the things that I wanted to highlight here is, well, how does MTSS and culturally responsiveness look like? In essence, when we're talking about culturally responsive MTSS, it's a team-based approach. In essence, what we're looking to do is tap into the knowledge of students, families, and family culture, and also school-wide system practices. In other words, how do we get various different cultural perspectives into the teams that we work with, in both in higher ed and also in we have student intervention teams. In higher ed, we call them behavioral intervention teams. But in essence, how do we get in experts that are, for example, working with undocumented families, undocumented students into these conversations also? So if we need a specific referral to like an immigrant attorney or to someone that does a psychological evaluation for immigrant purposes, in essence, how do we continue to build those networks? Similarly speaking, as we're talking about using culturally diverse and multiculturally rich group counseling frameworks, we want to be aware of the ones that, for example, the ones that I ended up highlighting that are going to be helping in terms of tapping into the cultural wealth of our audience and also the strengths of our students. One of the last things that I wanted to mention here is definitely gauging students, families perspectives, and also extending it to family voices. We want to create inclusion points for a variety of different voices. Family voices is very, very important, making sure that you are that advocate of making sure that things are not only translated, but having a translator when needed, especially in important meetings that are more critical in the areas of mental health. So what I wanted to do here is I just wanted to give you a small case example. This is more specific to the school counselors in the room, but in essence, this is one particular student that I ended up helping through a variety of different work that I've done in the past. But in essence, his name is changed. His name is not Raul, but he did go to a Chicago high school. But as he mentions here, he grew up in Ecuador around many gangs. He came here because he was fleeing the violence in his neighborhood. Some of his family members had been killed by gangs, and he arrived here when he was about 7 years old. In essence, his parents brought him here when they wanted a better life and when he wanted to go to school. So in essence, in this particular example, what you're hearing and what you're seeing is someone that is fleeing from gang violence. His family is, and now he's coming to live in Chicago, and he is part of your school. He is part of your school trying to find a better way in regards to escaping some of that violence And in addition to that, he also wants to, he's going to become part of your caseload. So in this particular example, what are some of the things that we want to also consider here? He's a 14-year-old male student, and his parents are undocumented. The parents are farmers and work long hours, so they're hardly at home. The family also lacks financial stability. The family has recently discovered they can apply to asylum visa since their family is escaping violence. And also the child exhibits an anxiety and has been bullied. So last year, he was an average student, but now he's failing all of his classes. But one of his classes during online learning, he's failing all of his classes, but one of his classes during online learning. The child is also about to be referred to truancy because he hasn't been showing up to classes. So this is actually a point of, this is a point where I can pause a little bit because I'm very curious as to what people are thinking about in regards to this particular situation. Again, this student is 13 years old, and in essence, what is happening, he's going through a lot of life changes, and what you're seeing is that he's failing his grades and he's not showing up to school. And I think I can give some pause here so that maybe people can unmute themselves and give me maybe some ideas, like how would we go about maybe helping this student? Can people unmute themselves?
I guess I would suggest that you kind of come up with, some smaller goals to attain, because it seems that the student has a lot going on,
Yeah.
and you're not gonna be able to solve it all in, a week or a day. So just coming up with small goals, like this week, we're gonna focus on this or that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. And it's very hard to see people's names, but I believe, was it Megan?
Yes.
Thank you, Megan, for sharing your thoughts. Any other thoughts or ideas here?
So this is Joseph from UW Parkside. I just want to say, right, like obviously understanding the scope, right, because we all have different roles and responsibilities within the institutions that we serve. So understanding the scope of your responsibility, and if it's something that falls outside of it, working with the student, but not only the student and their family as well, on getting them connected to resources, right? So having that conversation, that transparent conversation, like, hey, tell me where you're at right now, and have the family, kind of share that with you as well. And then also, like, having their input, like, what do you need? What do you need from me? How can I best serve you? In what ways can I connect you?
Yeah, very good. Definitely one has to understand the scope of their work, and also understand the boundaries that need to be set, and also the barriers that they may encounter. But I'm thinking this could easily be also a 25-year-old male student that could be in college, for example, exhibiting some of the similar traits in this area. But yes, you definitely want to make sure that you're aware of the different resources. And just to let you know, I will be sharing some resources in regards to helping this particular student here. But I did want to gauge, just get some initial thoughts. Any other ideas or thoughts here?
I'll share. This is Liz from Western Illinois University. And like Joseph, I would also get them, connected to the different resources, but making sure that they're also comfortable with me connecting them to these different resources or involving other people, because it's kind of a sensitive situation and I don't want anyone to feel kind of vulnerable. So definitely just making sure that they're comfortable with us sharing that information with other resources. But yes, same.
Any other thoughts here?
I think more on a higher education college setting, the possibility of maybe setting up some one-on-one time with the student, maybe offering to go out for lunch or paying for some type of maybe fun activity where we can kind of gain that trust and he feels like that is someone they can confide in, and going onto that maybe for like a mentorship opportunity, but just providing those easy access opportunities to come in. Maybe just being someone you can vent to can be super helpful sometimes, but offering, some food, some companionship, different opportunities like that if possible.
Yeah, that's a very good point, very good idea. And more specifically in regards to mentorships and creating those safe spaces, those are definitely things that are definitely needed, especially as the student may continue to go through different transitions, go through different challenges. Thank you, Laura. Any other thoughts here? Very good. So there's a variety of different ways that one can go about working with this student, and especially if the student is older, if they're in a college setting as opposed to a high school setting. One of the challenges here that here, let me go ahead and go. Actually, I want to talk a little bit more about here. But one of the things that I want to highlight here is more specifically whether the student is a child or an adult. One of the important things is they will be applying for an asylum visa. So this means being aware of any immigration lawyers, but also being aware of people that work with immigration lawyers. In this particular case, someone that would be able to do a psychological evaluation for free. So one of the things that I wanted to share with you here is I mentioned before the Refugee Immigrant Child Health Initiative. So the Refugee Immigrant Child Health Initiative not only works with young children, but it also works with adults. And they also provide asylum evaluations for free. So that's a resource that I wanted to share. And that's something that I wanted to, and I'm just gonna go ahead and type it here in the chat. Another resource that I wanted to share here as I am typing is www.cimh.org. I'm pretty sure it's that one. It's the Coalition for Immigrant Mental Health. But if you were looking for a free psychological evaluation, because this is something that may or may not be provided at either community college or four-year institution that you're at, because it's a specialized psychological evaluation, Coalition for Immigrant Mental Health. This is something that you can also easily take a look at. So these are two resources that I wanted to share. All right, so moving along here. Sorry, my pointer is a little bit off. All right. So in this particular example, there were a couple of things that I wanted to share, and the hyperlinks that I provide here are just some ideas. In other words, what we want to think about, and this is more specifically in schools, we want to think about a little bit more about what are some of the things that had been occurring during the pandemic even, right? In schools, we have something called a student service team, and this is usually like a problem-solving team, a behavioral intervention team, but in schools. Usually, in this particular case, there were two school counselors and an administrator, and they visited the home of the child. They were able to provide some information of local food pantries. They were also able to assist with providing some internet, an internet resource. And this is actually a hyperlink that I put here. But they also assisted the family in applying for the ICER emergency fund. Another thing in regards to referrals is providing a bilingual, bicultural mental health provider for a free psychological hardship evaluation. And that's something I already spoke about earlier as to where you can obtain that. They also referred it to the school's Rising Dream Action Club. again, this could be an affinity group, and it could be any of the variety of clubs, whether it be in a high school setting. If the student is older, it could also be in a college setting. One of the things that I also want to be a very strong advocate for in regards to schools, if this is not something that is already in place, I would definitely mention that it's important to have a bilingual community liaison, especially if you have a student services team. But in essence, what a bilingual community liaison does is they work for the student support services team, and they help them in relationship to translation, referrals, and resources. Many times what ends up happening in schools in your student services team, this could be like social workers, psychologists, and school counselors. Many times they don't have a bilingual person on their staff. So a bilingual community liaison, and this is something that I've seen in a variety of school districts. In essence, what they end up having is someone that has an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree that speaks Spanish, but in essence can work specifically with those students that speak a different language. So that's something to kind of keep in mind there. All right, so these are some ideas here. Again, as you're working in schools or you're working in higher ed, these ideas can also look a little bit different. Oops. All right. So what I wanted to do here is I actually wanted to just go back and highlight one particular, before I go to the question part, I wanted to highlight one particular one. And give me 1 second. Very good. So as you're thinking about the work that you do, as you're thinking about the roles that you play, one of the things that I hope you can walk away from today is an idea in terms of different approaches that you can use when you're working with undocumented students. We have a variety of different practices that we can use, both in the educational realm and also in the counseling realm. In the counseling realm, more specifically, for example, using a culturally responsive strengths-based approach. Culturally responsive strengths-based approaches can come in a variety of modalities. Like for example, strength-based solution-focused counseling, strength-based motivational interviewing, strength-based cognitive behavioral theory. These are all different. Strength-based is in essence a framework that can be utilized as a way to approach a variety of different evidence-based practices that you can already utilize in group, that you're probably already utilizing in groups. But it's also a way to kind of enhance that in a different, with a different theoretical lens. When we're working as educators in the classroom, I would lean towards not only culturally sustaining practices, but also cultural responsive and culturally responsive practices. Those that focuses on enhancing students' voice by you being a facilitator, and also enhancing students' voice by being culturally sustaining. And in essence, just in general, I'm gonna, by you being here today and really getting a bigger scope as to what multicultural concepts are, that in essence is what a good multicultural counselor does or practitioner does. They're always looking to build their knowledge base. But in other area of this is really being an advocate for your students. When you are an advocate, you also learn how to take a step back so that the person can also, so that you can help facilitate that the person finds their own voice through critical practice. So in summary, that's one of the things that I hope you can take away from. As I mentioned, I always find this space very, very rich in terms of diversity. And I hope that from my presentations, a variety of different things, you were able to add a variety of different things into your basket. But I wanted to give pause just to see if there was just one question maybe that we can address, if that's okay. Any questions at this time? And I'm going to take a look at this chat. Okay, so we got one. If you have worked with a previous family that was in a similar situation, you can set up a meeting with two families and share experiences. Okay, yeah. Possibly. I would always also be aware of the dynamics of your role in terms of confidentiality and whatnot. But that can possibly help, especially if it was like more in a group setting. I could see how shared experiences can help. And this would be like more of a tier 2 approach where we're developing groups. So that's a good mention there, Erica. Thank you. It's rcimh.org. I appreciate Liz for correcting me on that one because I didn't have the page right in front of me. Okay, with that in mind, wanted to thank everybody for coming today. Would you be able to go back to the slide with tiers 3 to see examples of universal, targeted, and intensive? Of course. Let me go ahead and go back to that one here. One of the things I'm going to, just to let you know, I'm pretty sure they're going to ask me for a copy of my slides. So that's something that I will be putting here. This one, I believe, Laura?
Yes, thank you so much.
Very good. There's a very good, there's a lot of different groups that work on MTSS. One is the Positive Behavioral Intervention and Support, PBIS, and that's an actual organization, PBIS. So if you type that into Google, you will find a lot of different, not only visuals, but resources in that area. I think it's called PBIS Support Networks, something like that. Very good. I'm going to leave you here with my email and my contact information. If you need anything, feel free to reach out to me and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Very good. Well, thank you everybody for your time. I hope you found it helpful, and thank you for your questions and your comments. I really appreciate your also your feedback throughout. It's very helpful to be engaging. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing because I want to see a couple faces if anybody has their camera on. But it's good to see a wide space of educators and practitioners that are continuing to develop themselves in this area. So I hope everybody enjoys the rest of the day here at Share the Dream. And did you want to say any closing notes here?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Oliver. You're getting lots of thank yous in the chat if you want to check those out. But at this point, we will end the session. Thank you again, everyone.
We'll go ahead and stop the recording.